The nurse pulled me aside in the hallway, glanced over her shoulder twice, and whispered 5 words I never expected to hear in a hospital. Don't eat anything your family brings you. I laughed at first. I actually laughed right there, in that sterile hallway, with an 4-pole trailing behind me, because it sounded like the beginning of some joke I hadn't heard the punchline to yet. Then I looked at her face, and the laugh died somewhere in my throat, because she wasn't joking. She wasn't even close to joking. My name is Walter. I was 62 years old, 3 days out from a heart procedure. It was supposed to be routine and up. Until that hallway conversation, the worst thing on my mind was hospital food and how much I missed my own bed. If you enjoy real stories about family betrayal and justice, subscribe now, because every story here proves the truth always finds its way out. Let me start from the beginning. I'd built a modest but steady business over 30 years, a hardware supply company that did well enough to put both my kids through college and buy a house with a yard big enough for my wife's garden. My wife's name was Linda. We'd been married 31 years through the ordinary hard patches every long marriage has, and out the other side of them, still choosing each other every morning. We had 2 children. My daughter Sarah lived 2 states away with her own family and called every Sunday like clockwork. My son Craig was from my first marriage before Linda, and he lived close enough that he was the one who visited the hospital. Most at the time felt like a blessing. The heart procedure itself went fine. Routine, the doctors kept saying a word that's supposed to be comforting until you're the one lying in the bed hearing it. I was set to stay 4 or 5 days for observation, nothing dramatic, and my family had been wonderful about it, taking turns, sitting with me, bringing me things from home, because hospital food, as I mentioned, is exactly as bad as everyone says. Linda had been by my side since before the anesthesia even wore off, holding my hand and reading aloud from a paperback mystery novel she never seemed to actually be reading, just filling the silence with the sound of her voice because she knew it calmed me. That was Linda in a nutshell, 31 years of knowing exactly what I needed before I knew how to ask for it. We'd met at a community college night class neither of us particularly needed back when I was still figuring out how to be a father to a young son from a marriage that hadn't worked out, and she'd taken to Craig back then with a gentleness I hadn't expected from someone who barely knew him. It was one of the reasons I'd fallen for her in the first place. Craig in particular had been showing up almost every evening with a thermos of soup. He said he'd made himself a recipe he told me he'd been working on for months, something he wanted me to try before I went home. It touched me honestly. Craig and I hadn't always been close. There'd been a stretch of years after his mother and I split when he barely spoke to me, and only in the last few years had things started to soften between us. The soup felt like a peace offering. I looked forward to it every evening. You always said hospital food would kill a man faster than the surgery, Craig had joked that first night, setting the thermos down on my tray table with a grin that reminded me uncomfortably now, in hindsight, of his mother's easy charm. Figured I'd save you the trouble. I'd laughed at the joke then. I think about it differently now. It was on the 3rd night that I started feeling strange after eating it, a heaviness in my limbs, a fog behind my eyes that didn't match the mild fatigue the doctors had warned me about. I mentioned it to the nurse on shift the next morning, mostly in passing, expecting her to say it was normal post-surgery grogginess. Instead, her face changed in a way I still remember clearly. She didn't say much right then, just made a note and told me she'd flag it for the doctor. It wasn't until later that afternoon in that hallway, with my chart clutched against her chest, like she wasn't sure she should be telling me any of this at all, that she said those 5 words. Don't eat anything your family brings you. Not until we've had a chance to look at something. Her name was Patricia. She'd been a nurse for almost 20 years. She told me later, long enough to know the difference between a patient having a bad reaction to normal medication and something that didn't add up the way it should. Your blood work from this morning came back with something unusual in it. she said, choosing her words, carefully glancing toward the nurses, stationed like she was aware of how this might sound. It's not consistent with anything you're currently prescribed. I flagged it to your doctor, and we're going to run it again to be sure it's not lab error. But until we know more, I'd feel better if you were careful about outside food. That's all I can tell you right now. You think someone's family did something on purpose? I said, testing the words in my own mouth, half hoping she'd correct me. I think Patricia said slowly that in 20 years I've learned not to assume the boring explanation just because it's more comfortable. Most of the time, it really is nothing. A supplement someone didn't mention a mix-up in dosage somewhere in the chart. But I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't ask you to be careful until we know which one this is. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to tell her she was overreacting, that Craig had been nothing but kind to me in that hospital room, that whatever showed up in a blood test had a boring, ordinary explanation, the way these things usually do. But something in the careful, deliberate way she'd chosen her words stayed with me the rest of that day, sitting in my stomach like a stone I couldn't swallow past. That evening, when Craig arrived with his thermos smiling, the same easy smile he always had, I told him I wasn't hungry. He seemed disappointed, almost hurt, and I felt a flicker of guilt for even entertaining the thought that had planted itself in my head. I told myself I was being paranoid. Surgery does strange things to a person's mind, I reasoned. Fear makes shadows out of ordinary furniture. You barely touched it last night. Either Craig said, setting the thermos down anyway, his voice carrying just the faintest edge under the concern. Doc say something about your appetite? Just tired, I told him, and watched something flicker across his face too quickly for me to name it. Relief, maybe? Or something closer to disappointment that didn't quite match a son, simply worried about his father skipping dinner. But I didn't eat the soup. I poured it into a container Patricia had quietly left in the room for me without either of us saying out loud exactly why, and I let it sit in the little refrigerator down the hall untouched. I caught Patricia alone in the hallway later that same night, restocking a supply cart outside my door, and I asked her the question that had been eating at me since our first conversation. What made you notice? Out of everyone on this floor, all the charts you go through in a week, what made you stop on mine? She thought about it for a moment before answering. Honestly? You mentioned the fog behind your eyes, almost like an afterthought, the way people do when they don't want to seem like they're complaining. Most people describing normal post-surgery fatigue don't use that particular phrase. It just sat wrong with me. I've learned to trust that feeling, even when I can't explain it yet. And if he'd been wrong, then I'd have ordered an extra blood panel for nothing, she said with the ghost of a tired smile. I can live with being wrong in that direction, Walter. It's the other direction that keeps nurses like me up at night. The next 2 days felt like walking on ice. I couldn't see the cracks in. Linda visited every afternoon, same as always, bringing me a crossword puzzle book and updates about her tomatoes, completely unaware of the quiet current running underneath everything now. I hadn't told her what Patricia said. I didn't know how to say it out loud without it sounding like an accusation. I wasn't ready to make against the sun. I still desperately wanted to be wrong about. Sarah called on her usual Sunday, and something made me mention carefully, almost testing the words, as I said them, that I'd been feeling foggier than expected since the surgery. There was a pause on the line long enough that I noticed it. Dad, she said slowly, has Craig been over a lot? Every night, I said. Bringing me soup, if you can believe it. Making a real effort. Another pause, longer this time. That's good, I guess, she said, though. Her tone suggested it wasn't the whole thought in her head. Dad, can I ask you something, and you won't think I'm being paranoid? You can ask me anything, Sarah. You know that. I asked her why she'd brought Craig up in the first place, and she hesitated before telling me something. I hadn't known that Craig's hardware franchise, for one, I'd helped him open 2 years earlier, with a loan against my own business, had been struggling badly. Struggling enough, she'd heard through a mutual friend, that he'd been quietly asking around about short-term loans nobody in the family wanted to give him again. "I didn't want to say anything while you were recovering," she said. "I still don't know if it means anything. I just don't know, Dad. Something about the timing of all this has been bothering me, and I couldn't figure out why until just now." I sat with that information for a long time after we hung up staring at the ceiling tiles doing math I didn't want to do. Craig knew better than almost anyone the details of my will. He'd helped me update it 2 years earlier, back when things between us were mending, and I wanted him to feel like an equal part of the family business going forward. He knew too that I'd recently mentioned revising it again since Sarah had just had her second child, and I wanted to make sure both of my grandchildren were provided for evenly. I hadn't gotten around to actually changing anything yet, but I had told Craig I planned to. The second blood test came back the following morning, and this time there was no ambiguity in Patricia's voice when she came to explain it. There was, in fact, a substance in my system that had no business being there, nothing that belonged in any of my regular prescriptions, present in an amount too significant to be some innocent lab mistake. The hospital's own internal safety team had already been notified standard procedure whenever something like this turned up, and hospital security wanted to speak with me quietly before anyone said a word to my family. I remember sitting across from the hospital's patient safety officer, a calm, unhurried woman named Miss Alvarez, and feeling like the floor had tilted slightly under the bed. She explained gently, but plainly, that they couldn't yet say how the substance had gotten into my system, whether through food, through some other route, or through an error somewhere in my care, but that given what I'd told her about the soup, and given that I'd stopped eating it 3 days earlier, at almost exactly the point my symptoms had started to level off, it was a lead worth taking seriously. "We're not accusing anyone yet," she said carefully, "but I'd like your permission to have that thermos and its container tested, along with anything else that's been brought into this room recently. And I'd ask that, for now, you don't mention any of this to your family. Not because we suspect all of them. Because if someone in your circle is responsible, the surest way to lose the evidence is to tip them off before we've had the chance to look. And if it's nothing," I asked, "if this is all some lab mistake, and I've spent a week suspecting my own son for no reason, then you'll have lost a week of peace of mind you didn't need to lose," she said honestly. "But I'd rather you have that week and be wrong than skip it and be right." I gave my permission. I hated giving it. Some part of me still hoped right up until the moment I signed the form that the whole thing would come back, explained by something harmless, cross-contamination, an ingredient I was simply reacting to anything at all that didn't require me to imagine my own son standing in my kitchen doing something deliberate. The next few days were the strangest of my life. I smiled at Craig when he visited. I let Linda bring me her usual crossword books and asked about her tomatoes, like nothing at all had changed, because Miss Alvarez had asked me to keep behaving normally while the testing was underway, and because some frightened, stubborn part of me still wasn't ready to believe what my own instincts were telling me. It was Linda, of all people, who noticed something first, not because she suspected anything, but because she knew Craig better than I gave her credit for. She mentioned almost offhand, while sitting beside my bed one afternoon, that Craig had asked her twice, that week, in what she'd assumed was harmless curiosity, exactly which of my medications the hospital had me on, and whether they interacted with certain over-the-counter supplements. She'd thought nothing of it at the time. Craig had always been the kind of person who researched things obsessively, she said, ever since he was a teenager. It was only saying it out loud to me, watching my face carefully, not react the way I wanted it to, that she started to look uncertain herself. "Walter," she said slowly, "what's going on?" "Linda, don't Linda me. I've been married to you for 31 years. I know what your face does when you're keeping something from me, and it's doing that right now." I told her everything then quietly in that hospital room, because I couldn't keep her in the dark any longer and still call myself honest with her. I watched her face go through disbelief, then anger, then something quieter and sadder that I recognized because I'd been carrying the same thing myself for days. "I brought him into this family," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, staring at her own hands. "I used to make his lunches for school. I taught him to ride a bike in the driveway because you were always working. And I sat here every day telling him how grateful I was that he was being so attentive to you." She shook her head slowly. "If this is real, Walter, I don't know how I'm supposed to look at him again. We don't know anything for certain." Yet I said, though, I wasn't sure anymore if I was saying it for her benefit or my own. The results came back 6 days after that first strange evening. The lab confirmed what Patricia's instincts had already told her: a substance present in both my system and in a small residual sample from the thermos container, in a combination and quantity that ruled out any accidental explanation. It wasn't something that belonged in food. It wasn't something that could have simply ended up there by chance. Detective Ruiz, the officer assigned once the hospital formally notified police, was thorough in a way that felt almost gentle, if that makes sense. He didn't treat me like a fragile old man or a hysterical one. He asked careful, methodical questions about my relationship with Craig, about the will, about the timeline of his visits, about anything unusual I'd noticed in the weeks before my surgery that I might not have thought twice about at the time. It was in answering those questions out loud that I remembered something I'd nearly forgotten. A conversation 3 weeks earlier, where Craig had asked almost too casually whether I'd finalized the changes to my will, or whether there was still time before anything was official. I'd told him without thinking much of it that nothing was final yet. I wonder now whether that single sentence was the moment everything started. Hospital security notified the police, as they're required to in situations like that, and what followed wasn't the dramatic confrontation you might picture from a movie. It was quieter, slower, and in its own way, harder to sit through detectives asking careful questions, financial records, eventually subpoenaed, showing exactly how deep Craig's business troubles ran, and a picture assembling itself piece by piece that none of us wanted to see completed. Craig never confessed outright, not in the way you'd hope for some clean, satisfying moment of remorse. When investigators finally spoke with him, he offered explanations that shifted and thinned the more specific the questions became, confident at first, then quietly unraveling once the details stopped matching up. He claimed he didn't understand how anything harmful could have ended up in food he'd made himself. He couldn't explain, though, why his internet search history from the weeks before my surgery showed research into exactly the kind of interaction the lab had found. He couldn't explain why he'd been asking Linda pointed questions about my medications days before the first blood test came back unusual. The district attorney's office ultimately pursued charges related to what had happened based on the physical evidence, the financial motive, and the pattern of behavior the investigation had uncovered. I won't pretend the legal process that followed was fast or simple. These things rarely are. But it moved forward, methodically, the way it's supposed to. And for once, that slow, unglamorous machinery worked in favor of the people it was meant to protect. There was a single conversation with Craig, arranged carefully through his attorney and mine, before any of the legal proceedings really got underway. I didn't go into it looking for an apology exactly. I think I went in looking for some version of him that made sense of everything, some explanation that would let me understand rather than just condemn. What I got instead was a man who couldn't quite meet my eyes, who kept circling around the actual truth without ever landing on it, fully talking instead about pressure and desperation, and how he'd never really believed anything serious would happen, as though that made the intention behind it any smaller. I left that conversation without the closure I'd hoped for. I've since made peace with the fact that some conversations don't give you closure. They just give you the truth, and you learn to carry it instead. I think about Craig often even now. I don't think he was born capable of something like this. I think fear and desperation and shame about failing at something he'd wanted so badly to succeed had wore down some part of Him that used to know better until the version of himself standing in my hospital room with a thermos of soup wasn't entirely the son I remembered raising. That doesn't excuse what he did. It just means I've stopped looking for a simple villain in this story, because the truth, as usual, was messier and sadder than that. Sarah flew out the week everything came to light and stayed with us for almost a month. And in a strange way, that terrible stretch of time brought the three of us, Linda, Sarah, and me, closer than we'd been in years. We really talked about things we'd been avoiding for a long time, about old resentments from the years after my first marriage ended that none of us had ever properly put into words. We went to family counseling together, something I never would have agreed to before all of this, and something I'm grateful for now, even on the sessions that left me raw and exhausted afterward. I did eventually update my will the way I'd told Craig. I planned to. The reasons for finally doing it looked nothing like what any of us had expected going in. I made sure my grandchildren were provided for fairly. I made sure Linda would never have to worry. And I made peace slowly with the fact that some relationships don't heal cleanly, no matter how much you want them to. I went back to visit Patricia at the hospital about 2 months after everything settled, just to say thank you properly, the kind of thank you that doesn't fit easily into a hallway conversation while she's still on shift. I brought her a box of good coffee and a card, feeling a little foolish about how small the gesture seemed against what she'd actually done for me. You didn't just flag a lab result, I told her. You saved my life, and honestly, I think you saved what's left of my family too, even the part of it that's hard now. She waved that off the way people do when they're uncomfortable being called a hero, and told me the same as before, that it wasn't heroism. Just 20 years of paying attention to small things that didn't add up, and enough experience to trust that instinct, even when it was inconvenient, even when it meant pulling a patient aside in a hallway to say something that sounded on its face almost unbelievable. Most people would have laughed it off, I said. I nearly did. Most people do, she agreed. That's usually fine. Sometimes it isn't. You just never know which conversation is which one until it's already happened. There's a moment about 4 months after I was finally discharged that I keep returning to. Linda and I were sitting on the back porch on a quiet evening, the same porch where Craig used to help me stain the fence every other summer when he was younger, back before any of this, back when I still thought I understood exactly who my son was. Linda reached over and took my hand without saying anything, the way she does when words feel too small for what she's actually trying to say, and we just sat there for a long while watching the light fade over her tomato plants. Do you regret it? She asked eventually. Believing Patricia, letting all of this happen the way it did? I thought about it honestly before answering, because it deserved an honest answer. I regret that it was true, I told her. I don't regret listening to her. I think if I'd ignored what she told me that day, out of some idea of loyalty to a son who didn't deserve it in that moment, I might not be sitting on this porch with you right now. She squeezed my hand a little tighter at that, and neither of us said anything else for a while. We didn't need to. Patricia still works on that hospital floor. I went back to see her once months later, just to say thank you, because I've thought more than once about what would have happened if she hadn't trusted her own instincts enough to pull me into that hallway. She told me it wasn't heroism, just 20 years of paying attention to small things that didn't add up. I told her that small things paid attention to at the right moment are sometimes the difference between a family quietly grieving and a family, however, imperfectly still standing. If this story moved, you share it with someone who believes justice always finds a way. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done? And subscribe for more real stories every week.